If you suddenly got a second chance at life, as in you've just restarted your entire life, what would you do with that chance? I imagine there's a lot of answers about using your knowledge to make loads of money or fix choices you regret making. Hell, I know that's what I would be doing. Looking back on our lives, we can always make these claims, but hindsight is 20/20, and those kinds of hypothetical situations never actually happen to us. Still, that doesn't make the situation any less fertile ground for storytelling. In fact, one of the greatest isekais to grace the genre is all about that second chance fantasy. Enter Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation, a story about a man given a miraculous second chance at life after wasting his first one. The story begins with the main character, a 35-year-old shut-in scumbag with no talent, job, or redeeming qualities, getting beaten up and thrown out onto the streets on a rainy day. From there, he jumps into traffic in an attempt to save some high school kids from a reckless driver, and he gets himself killed in the process. However, he finds that death isn't exactly what he would have expected it to be, and he finds himself cradled in the arms of a young European-looking woman speaking a foreign language. This is the point at which Rudius, as he becomes known, realizes what just happened to him. He's been reincarnated, and thus your average isekai story begins. And while you can certainly see some of the usual isekai shenanigans involved in this, Jobless Reincarnation stands out for just how well it actually executes all of this stuff. You see, it does something most isekai fails to do. It fully embraces the fantasy elements, forces Rudy to actually train his powers from zero, and creates a rich world full of lore and life that totally enamors you. In summary, Jobless Reincarnation is the peak that the isekai genre should be aiming for. I think one of the greatest strengths of this series is that its characters are so well done. Characters are developed well for their roles in the plot, and even the weakest of them come off as thoughtfully developed and well-crafted members of the cast who serve more than just their role most excellently. Let's just pull a random character out of the selection, like Paul. Paul Greyrat, Rudius' New World father, is a good example of the way characters are put together in this series. He's a mix of a great father but a very flawed man, and it really makes him feel like he was given more thought beyond just being a mechanism to the plot. He cares about his family and invests a great deal of effort into trying to instill useful skills into Rudy. But he also ends up proving to be one of the horniest characters in the series. Through his actions and his time on screen, you really get the sense that he loves his family, but he's not perfect and has his own issues. The more you learn about him in his bachelor days, the more you realize he was an absolute menace, as he became somewhat synonymous with out-of-control sex drive. And that didn't help when tempted with the idea of clapping the hired help and ultimately getting her pregnant. He fails as a husband in this instance, but the rest of his part in the story for Season 1 is spent mostly portraying him in a positive light. He isn't a shitty dad who doesn't care or a bumbling oaf with no ability. He's a fairly prominent swordsman and a genuinely kind man who just happens to let his second brain do more thinking than it should. It's this element of humanity and depth to the characters that is one of the reasons I love the character construction of this series. Everyone feels like they're given more thought than just playing a trope or filling a role in the plot, and it makes the story come alive. Paul's failings have far-reaching effects on the story at large and even earns Rudius a favor from the house maid. But we'll continue with these examples. Eris Greyrat, Rudius' distant relative whom he sent to tutor, is another good one. She's an absolute feisty, bitchy child who uses violence to get what she wants. Effectively the epitome of a spoiled brat. She's so horrible that Rudius concocts a plan to fake her kidnapping in order to convince her that she should take her studies more seriously. And it works, but not in the way he expected. From there, the two get closer and closer to each other as Eris gains respect for Rudy's magic and intelligence. She even helps celebrate his 10th birthday by the end of their time at her family home. But she improves even more after a calamity teleports the two of them across the world and drops them off in the middle of a wasteland continent. Their relationship develops much further as they come to rely on each other and their guide Rijerd for survival in the harsh lands of the Demon Continent. By this stage of the game, Eris is very open about how much she admires Rudius, and it shows a whole new side to her. She's gone from that bratty child she was at her introduction to someone much more pleasant. It also helps to see her enamored with the adventure of traveling around the world. She develops into a much more endearing person. one people can actually come to like. By the time of her exit at the end of Season 1, she was one of my favorite characters in the series, but she still shows the flaws in her character. She spent so long focusing only on herself, she lacks certain interpersonal skills most people wouldn't, and she makes assumptions about how her actions will play out that are blatantly wrong. Her headstrong nature leaves her absolutely confident in every decision, and that leads to her seemingly abandoning Rudy. And while she's convinced he'll understand her reasoning and be okay, all it does is leave him heartbroken and hurting. On top of all of that, she's very quick to violence unnecessarily in some situations. And that, of course, causes some strain for the group as they're traveling across the world, as Eris is more often likely to jump into throwing fists than trying to talk things out. Of course, I'd be remiss not to mention the character work of the main character himself, Rudius Greyrat. You see, Rudy has a lot of baggage from his past life. He became a shut-in during high school when he was publicly humiliated for being fat. He pissed off a couple of bullies when they cut him in line in the cafeteria, and they ended up stripping him naked and tying him to the front gate. That traumatized him to the point where he couldn't even leave the house and constantly hallucinated that people were laughing at him and mocking him. It's a very critical moment when Rudy finally decides to go beyond the garden wall of his new family home and realizes not everyone is out there laughing at him and making fun of him. And once he's finally able to overcome that paranoia, his whole life opens up to him. It's not long until he encounters Sylphiette and saves her from the bullies attacking her because of her strange hair color. He's also forced to stand up for his decision when the bullies lie about the encounter to get him in trouble with his father Paul. A confrontation that shows the father's ego and lack of trust early on in their relationship. Rudy proves early on to be a scheming, conniving pervert who exploits his situation as a child to get up to things that no adult would ever get away with. However, over the course of his life, he grows as a person. While he's still very much that same sort of closeted pervert, his journey across the whole world shows his growth out of that constantly exploitative and scheming childish aspect and up into a more noble person whose heroics aren't entirely motivated by his own selfish gain. And while he was never evil from the start, you can tell he becomes much more tame by the end of the journey across the world, to the point where Season 2 Rudy is almost a completely different character. He goes out of his way to help people and do the right thing for no significant reason. He actually comes off as a much kinder character. But his heroic actions are usually followed by some moment where the less appealing part of his personality leaks out, or just him making a massive blunder. The theme of Rudius being a bit of a degenerate continues throughout the whole series, regardless of how much he tempers it, but it's offset by the fact that he's constantly a better man. He helps people out quite a bit, and behaves mostly politely, so he redeems himself from a lot of his scummy behavior. Ultimately, his story can be summed up as him stumbling and falling down, but getting back up again and continuing to move forward. Of course, things are never quite that simple, and one of the amazing things about Jobless Reincarnation is that it captures that very real aspect of life in the way that it never stays good forever. Rudius overcomes his old fears and makes friends, but he's suddenly shipped off to half a country away to tutor a girl who hates him. After finally earning the trust and friendship of that girl, the two of them are teleported to the other side of the world by a calamity and forced to find their way home alongside a man who happens to be of a tribe notable for their savagery. Even when things start to go smoothly, Rudius learns that his whole family was swept up in that disaster and scattered across the world. And upon his safe return home, he finds a completely devastated country where Eris's parents and grandparents were either killed by the teleportation or executed in the resulting power struggle, which sort of puts a burden on both of them. And the icing on the top of all of that is that a misunderstanding between Rudy and Eris breaks his heart and sends him into a fit of depression when she suddenly leaves his side without proper explanation. He's left wondering what he did wrong, while Eris is looking to become strong enough to stand beside him after realizing she wasn't near strong enough to protect him from Orsted. Rudy is just as flawed and human as everyone else in the series. He may be an adult on the inside, but his lack of knowledge and experience still shows through with his faults and failures. From minor things like abusing a new skill to humiliate Eris in a practice duel, to much more damning moments where his decisions led directly to the deaths of others because he was too greedy, He has no shortage of his own mistakes to deal with, both from his past life and this one. His failings become learning moments though, and his emotional state fluctuates with each of his shortcomings. And those moments where he finally snaps from trying to bear it all silently on his own are especially good. It makes for moments where you can see just how humanly imperfect Rudy really is, and you can sympathize with his struggles because you can understand him better through these broken moments. Moving forward with the review. The world of this anime is incredible, so much so that there was never a time where I felt like something was underdeveloped. It had unique cultures suited to their environments, with their own languages that are actually used in the series. And every bit of it was teeming with life, lore, and history. Power systems were well defined with rankings, and there was even enough information to define different martial arts styles within the world. The history and lore help add more meaning to the storytelling, with every minor event having well thought out history and appropriate emotional reactions from everything that happens, as well as tying into the overall story or importance of the moment. All of this helps you get a grasp of the ever-changing locations in the world, as each environment, given their culture, is distinct enough to tip you off to the fact that it's a very different place. And because there's always something new, it makes the world feel massive. The Demon Continent is a very different place both environmentally and culturally than the rest of the world, and human nations vary drastically in architecture and behavior and dress as well. And when it comes to visual appeal, the series is incredible to the point where I want to get my hands on some of the Blu-rays of this to see how good it looks. Combat is treated with actual care and given very gorgeous animation, and there's never a moment where I feel like there's some sort of low-effort bullshit going on. Even if those moments are short, they're still treated with love and care, and it adds so much appeal to the whole thing by not pulling you out of the story. Characters' designs are also pretty solid, with both the body and clothing design, each lending to the immersion in the world by adding more layers to the culture from which that character hails. It might not seem like much, but these sorts of tiny details add a layer of polish onto the series that really impresses me. They're often simpler and realistic, rather than the usual overdone and outlandish outfits that many series in this genre try to use to make their characters stand out. The show also never seems to hit a lull. With the main focus of the story being Rudius as a character, there's never really a moment that feels out of place. It may be hard to tell exactly what the end goal of the series is at this point, but that doesn't mean it's meandering through. It still feels like there's a genuine direction. It's just that the narrative hasn't revealed all the pieces yet. There's real stakes and real development happening at every step of the way. Even things that could probably be considered minor events in the grand scheme of things, like Rudius joining up with Counter Arrow, or a random stop at a village on the Demon Continent, give a great deal of depth to the struggles Rudius goes through and how he develops as a character. It even turns something as outrageous as erectile dysfunction into a major character arc for Rudius, one that was actually handled really well. As a side note, don't let that comment turn you off from this series. It may sound cringe, but the whole part of the story is still top tier. It's an offshoot of Rudy's heartbreak after seemingly being abandoned by Eris, and that has a lot to do with him overcoming that feeling of heartbreak. But I think the reason that all this is so good is that there's so much substance and humanity to the story. The substance increases the weight of the whole story, even more so as it focuses on Rudy as a character. At its core, what I found was a story about self-improvement and accountability. Rudius' character goes from someone solely focused on hiding away from his pain and feeding his own desires to a much more noble and mature person. But it's the message that things won't just magically improve for us that really hits the hardest. The contrast between Rudius' previous life, where he gave in to his fears and pain and did nothing to try and move past it, and his new life, where he consistently makes a conscious effort to move forward, is the most meaningful part of this to me. Rudius chooses to use his second chance and make the effort to overcome the things that haunt him. After spending an entire lifetime wallowing in self-pity, he finally realizes that the only way to make a change is to choose to do so himself. This mantra is repeated over and over again, as he reflects on his old life and chooses to do things differently this time around. And that starts to put his whole previous life into perspective as he's finally able to see past his self-pity and realize that his misery in life was ultimately his choice. He begins to realize his loneliness was his own fault, that his bitterness towards the world was his own choice, and that his wasted life was entirely his own fault. This part of the narrative culminates in the point where he declares his desire to stay in this world to Nanahoshi, as he had finally chosen to put in the effort to build the life he wanted and break free of his old shackles. Of course, his moving forward doesn't come without new troubles. Rudy learns that life in the real world comes with accountability for his actions, another thing that helps him realize just how responsible he was for his own misery. Even when he makes new mistakes or when he's burdened with new heartache, it's only once he finally comes to the decision to move forward and take control of his own life that he can actually make any progress in anything. Rudy is still walking through his second life with only a partial understanding of the grander game of it all. As I said earlier, he's prone to making mistakes because he's still not fully mature and lacks in many areas due to the fact that he's been running away from life for so long and trying to offload the blame for his own issues onto the world rather than his own decisions. Jobless Reincarnation gets a 9.7 out of 10. I can only really dock points for this ridiculous emphasis on sex in the series. I'm not really a prude when it comes to that, but sometimes it just feels a little over the top. Still, it's a well-crafted, well-loved, well-animated, and all-around excellent anime and story with virtually no flaws to it. If you like more mature fantasy stories, ones that are fairly nuanced and deep, this might just be the thing for you. It's truly an amazing work of art and one that moved me when it decided to get into the narrative meat of the stories. It put into perspective for me that if I really want something, sitting and wishing for it to happen won't make it real. Our lives are ours, and we have to take responsibility for the condition we're in before we can start working towards a better place. That road won't be easy. The journey will suck, but it will be so much better than allowing yourself to remain stagnant, constantly wishing for things to get better. We can spend as much time as we like looking back at what we can't change, but it will never make a difference. The only thing we can do is to correct course in the present and aim for the life we want. But that's about enough out of me. Please, if you like this video, consider liking and subscribing, as those simple but free actions really do help me out quite a bit. Also, if you have some thoughts of your own, you are perfectly welcome to leave them down in the comments. I always appreciate people who engage with me. I hope you have a wonderful day and an excellent week. Until we meet again. Later.